Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. For today's video, we're going to be talking about some case law. Specifically, the case law that we're going to be talking about is going to be Terry versus Ohio. This was a monumental case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It occurred in Cleveland, Ohio on October the 31st, 1963. The findings of the case, in summary, were: under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, a police officer may stop a suspect on the street and frisk him or her without probable cause to arrest if the police officer has reasonable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime, and has the reasonable belief that the officer may be armed and dangerous presently. So this was a case that, as I said, it was monumental and it changed a lot of stuff about police work. The major changes that were brought into play due to Terry were the determination of whether or not an officer has the authority to detain somebody, and the way the Supreme Court talks about it constitutionally is to actually arrest a person, prevent a person's movement. That's the way the Supreme Court views a detention. Prior to Terry, a police officer could not arrest or detain a person without probable cause. If they had probable cause, they could grab onto somebody, search them, take them down, do all those things. If they just suspected that somebody had committed a crime and wanted to talk to that person, they had to engage in a casual conversation. And during a casual conversation, or casual encounters, as police officers talk about, the person is actually free to leave because the officer does not have probable cause to arrest and detain that person. After Terry, they decided that if an officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that criminal activity is afoot, they can then detain that person. That detention constitutionally is considered an arrest. Just because you're arrested doesn't mean you're being charged with a crime and taken downtown, but it means that you are not free to go. You are detained. Your person has been arrested. They went further on to say that if you have reason to believe, like a reasonable suspicion, that the crime that person was about to commit is a violent crime and that person might be armed, you can then frisk that person, pat them down, or do a Terry search. Terry frisk, Terry search. These are terms that are kind of interchangeable. And maybe they're used interchangeably when they shouldn't be, but they are nonetheless. So in order to understand how the court came to this decision, let's look at the actual arguments that were made in this case. All right, so this is what actually happened in the case of Terry versus Ohio. It was October 31st, 1963, and the man up right above me here, this is Police Detective Martin McFadden. Police Detective McFadden was working in plainclothes in a retail district of Cleveland, Ohio on this particular day. And he described his actions as he was basically sitting in you've got retail stores and you got the door and there's a recess where the doors go in. He was just sitting in that area. He was a police officer with the Cleveland Police Department. He had been on the department for 39 years at the time and had worked as a detective for 35 of those 39 years. So as you can imagine, he was not a young man at the time of this incident. What he described was he was standing where he was, and these three men on the other side of the screen are the defendants. That two of them were placed under arrest, the third one was not. These three men are John W. Terry, Richard Chilton, and then Carl Katz. John Terry, the one that initiated this whole thing, he's the one on the far left of my screen as I'm looking at it. It's in reverse to me, so I don't know how it looks to you. I'm not good at whatever. So that's the guy that was carrying the small pistol. He was the one that kicked everything off because he was the first one that Officer McFadden searched. Then you had Chilton over there carrying a revolver, and Carl Katz was just an accomplice that was not charged on this particular day. So as Officer McFadden is sitting in this retail district, and I've got a little picture of what was going on there. So this is a picture that shows the store that he was sitting at and shows the activity that these men were doing. Also shows where he approached the men. So he's standing in the doorway of this retail establishment, and his purpose was he was working in plainclothes to try to prevent retail crime, retail theft, and stuff like that. He's standing there, and he observes three men standing on Huron Road Southeast. He sees these three men. They're kind of standing together, and then they're standing together talking, which is not in itself suspicious. But then what happened is one of the three men walks down the street and he stops in front of a particular store. He kind of stands there for a little while looking around. He then turns and he peers in through the window of the store. He then turns and puts his back to the wall, looks around again, and then continues on down the street. Then the next man that was in this group of three walks down the street, does the same thing, pauses in front of the store, looks in the windows, looks around, walks down the street. He actually joins the first man that was in that group. Now he's down here, and they're standing together. Then the third man walks down the street, does the exact same thing, looks in the window, meets with those other two men. At one point in time, I believe it was Carl Katz, he separates from the two men, but stays in the area where he can watch them. Then the two men walk back in front of that store, repeating the exact same thing 4 or 5 times, according to the officer's testimony. And this is, I think, something that everybody would understand is peculiar behavior. You've got men that are standing together, walk down the street one at a time, congregate, and then walk down the street one at a time, congregate again. So according to Detective McFadden, he believed that these men were getting ready to stick up this store. As it would turn out, the store that the window that they continued to look in was actually a jewelry store. So he, in his mind, believed that these men were about to commit an armed robbery on a jewelry store. Once the men completed their final pass, they all joined together once again and walked around the corner onto Euclid Avenue. He followed the men down to Euclid Avenue, approached them, and he walked up to Terry first. He said, "Hey, I'm Detective McFadden. I need to talk to you. What's your name?" That's when, from his description, John Terry mumbled something or said something quickly, was being evasive, which raised the detective's suspicion even further. He then grabbed onto Terry, which in the court viewed as an arrest. He grabbed onto Terry, started patting him down for weapons because he felt that these men were about to commit an armed robbery. He felt that they were armed, and he knew that his life was in danger by making this confrontation. It's one officer in plain clothes. He's approaching 60 years old at this point in his life against 3 younger men that he believed to be armed. So he spun Terry around. He physically grabbed him, physically assaulted him as far as the court is concerned, detained him, aggressively arrested him, spun him around, patted him down for weapons, felt inside his coat pocket what he knew to be a firearm. He takes Terry's jacket off, orders the 3 men into the store that he was standing out in front of, told the clerk, "Hey, call the wagon," which means these guys are now effectively under arrest. He reaches into the jacket, takes the gun out, secures it, pats down the second guy, which was Chilton, finds a revolver on him. I'll put these pictures back up. Finds the revolver on Chilton and then searches Carl Katz, does not find a weapon. All 3 men were taken down to the station, interviewed, and Terry and Chilton were placed under arrest for carrying concealed weapons. Now, this went to these men were convicted in local court. They appealed. An appeals court basically suppressed the gun evidence, saying that this was an illegal arrest and detention because they're saying that Detective McFadden did not have probable cause to arrest these men at the time that he interacted with them. What the men and their attorney was saying was, look, these guys were just out on a public street. They were minding their own business. They had not committed a crime. The officer did not have probable cause to believe that they had committed a crime. Therefore, he detained them illegally. What he did was an illegal detention because he did not have probable cause. An appeals court agreed with them and overturned the conviction. This went to the Supreme Court. And at the Supreme Court, the state of Ohio, I forget the attorney's name, but he argued that, the officer did have probable cause to believe that they were about to commit a crime, and that an officer's job is, when possible, to prevent crime from happening. And that you have to look at the totality of the circumstances when making this decision. And when you look at the totality of the circumstances, the officer had a reasonable suspicion, reason to believe that they were about to commit an armed robbery and that they would be armed because of everything that they were doing. They weren't simply standing on the street and walking down the street. They were acting in a very suspicious manner, in a manner that an experienced police officer would believe they were about to commit these crimes. When it went to the Supreme Court, the court agreed that the officer did not have probable cause to stop the men. He did not have probable cause, did not have enough to charge them with a crime, but due to the totality of the circumstances, he had enough reasonable suspicion to stop, detain them. They were not free to go. And since he had enough information to stop and detain them, and had enough information to believe that they could be and most likely were armed, he also had the right to, in order to protect himself and his safety, pat them down for weapons, just patting down the exterior of their clothes. They determined that this was a very brief detention, and it was a very minor intrusion into their person. Therefore, the court decided that this was permissible. So we now went from, you need probable cause in order to detain somebody. Now you can detain somebody based on reasonable suspicion, and you can use that reasonable suspicion to gain your probable cause to make an arrest. A couple of things that I took from the actual, this is from the decision that was written by the judges. I just thought some of this was interesting. It says the facts of this case are illustrative of a proper stop and incident frisk. Officer McFadden had no probable cause to arrest Terry for anything, but he had observed circumstances that would reasonably lead an experienced, prudent police officer or policeman to suspect that Terry was about to engage in a robbery or burglary. His justifiable suspicion afforded a proper constitutional basis for accosting Terry, restraining his liberty of movement briefly, and addressing questions to him. And Officer McFadden did so. When he did, he had no reason whatsoever to suppose that Terry might be armed, apart from the fact that he suspected him of planning a violent crime. And then it goes on further to talk about whether or not an officer has to linger around, ask a bunch of questions, or answer your questions once you're detained. This, I think, is something that people need to remember. If an officer believes somebody has committed or is about to commit a violent crime, or is in the process of committing a violent crime, and they grab onto that person, these people often say, I haven't committed a crime. Why are you detaining me? What basis? Tell me the law. Get your supervisor out here. The officer is not required to do that. They can actually just grab onto somebody as long as they have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that violent crime is afoot. They can grab onto that person and search them. And here's what the judge had to say about that. There's no reason why an officer rightfully but forcefully confronting a person suspected of a serious crime should have to ask one question and take the risk that the answer might be a bullet. So that is Terry versus Ohio. This was a case that changed the standard from an officer being able to forcefully detain a person. Prior to Terry versus Ohio, it was probable cause. After Terry versus Ohio, it's a reasonable, articulable suspicion. So if an officer has a reasonable suspicion that somebody has committed, is in the commission of a crime, or is about to commit a crime, the officer can detain that person and force them to answer questions. If an officer believes that that person is about to commit a violent offense and might be armed, the officer is also allowed to conduct a pat down for weapons. I think that's it. Yeah. I never know how to end my videos. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you guys later.